Many American families have their dysfunction, but in only one American family has the racist, misogynistic, ignorant, blowhard uncle become the President of the United States. What do you think that's like? Well, we don't have to guess, because Mary L. Trump, the niece of Donald Trump, has written a bestseller about the horrific family environment that produced Donald Trump. The book is called Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. After the Trump family went to court to stop the book and lost, it was published last week and has reportedly sold 1 million copies. The book is a harrowing account of a family fueled by ego, competition, the pursuit of wealth, personal destruction, and fraud. Mary Trump's depiction of Donald Trump as a broken human being is more explanatory than revelatory. She doesn't show us a Trump we haven't already seen, but she explains how and why he became a man who is more concerned about his TV ratings than the deaths of 140,000 fellow Americans. Mary, thanks for being with us.
David, it's a real honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure too. You and I met, so to speak, shortly before Election Day 2016.
Yeah.
I had tracked you down thinking you might have interesting information to share about your uncle, especially since you had been in a bitter lawsuit with him and his siblings over your grandfather's will. That's the estate of Fred Trump, the father of Donald Trump. And there was a related lawsuit about Donald and his brother and sisters cutting off medical insurance for you and your brother's family. You replied to me and said you are horrified at the possibility Trump might become president, but that you felt you couldn't come forward at that time. Can you explain what held you back then?
Yeah, unfortunately, at the time, I didn't feel that it would make a difference. Part of that is because in my family, learned helplessness is pretty prevalent among most of us. And that's just the sense that nothing we do matters. Nobody's going to listen. There's no escape from any bad situation we might find ourselves in. So that played a big role. But maybe more saliently, at the time, I felt that I didn't have anything concrete. It would have been my opinion. He said, she said, and at the time, nobody seemed to care what he was doing or saying. He was getting away with everything. And I literally felt that I would be maligned and dismissed totally out of hand.
Now, after the election, you sent me an email saying you were devastated that Trump won, and that a large part of the electorate did not care about his racism, misogyny, and ignorance and dishonesty. Yeah. I never imagined this would be the outcome, you said. You noted you wanted to do what you could to mitigate the damage and make sure that the horror that has been unleashed lasts for as short a time as possible. But you also said that taking action could lead to your family and that of your brothers paying a very big price. Was there something else going on? Did you feel that you'd be threatened or your brother's family would somehow be harmed if you said anything?
There's nothing specific I can say about that. You know, it was just knowing who they are. They're very vindictive people. And again, it was the same conundrum I had found myself in before the election. There was still nothing solid that I could offer up to you that I was aware of anyway. Clearly there was, I just wasn't aware of it. You know, I had totally forgotten about the 19 boxes of documents in my lawyer's storage facility.
So when then did you decide to write this book?
It was after the New York Times. Part of that process too was sort of filling in some details for them and giving them context as much as I could. And I suddenly started remembering how much I knew, because for various reasons, I tried not to think about them very much for the last couple of decades.
And when we talk about the New York Times, we're talking about the piece that came out in October 2018, which is all explained in your book, that showed how the Trump family, Donald Trump and his siblings, had created, according to, these are the Times' characterization, not mine, massive fraud to avoid paying hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes, what seems to be a criminal enterprise. That was sort of a turning point in that you had, not gone public. You had spoken with me, but it was all off the record. Any other reporter that had reached out to you had gotten nothing. And for months, the Times had been trying to get you, and you had turned them down. And then finally you decided to go get this material, not even realizing what was in it, correct?
Yeah. And also initially, even though they came to me with a thesis, it took me quite some time to sort of wrap my head around the fact that I could actually contribute something potentially valuable. And then there was also just sort of the knee-jerk, don't ever talk to reporters thing that applied to everybody in my family, of course, except Donald. So even though I wasn't allied with them, that was just sort of ingrained in me. And the actual turning point came after I fractured my foot. And I had way too much time to sit on my couch watching the news and scrolling through my Twitter feed. And none of the news was good. It seemed to be getting worse every day. And I couldn't escape it because I had my foot elevated for about 4 months. And finally I thought, you know what, maybe there's something I can do. This is getting unbearable. And I called Sue Craig
of the New York Times, who had contacted you weeks earlier, and you had basically turned it down. And I can attest to the fact that you're good at turning down reporters, because even after the election, every few months I checked in with you to see if you would go public. I thought you had something to say without even realizing you had these boxes of tax information, and you always politely said no to me.
Yeah, and to be fair, Sue wrote letters over months, so it wasn't like she just knocked on my door. I'm like, oh, okay, come on in. It took her a very long time. She, like you, was very persistent. The difference is she actually knew about the documents, and I totally forgot about them. So she was able to remind me, and that kind of flipped the switch too.
Now, when we first spoke, again, it was right before the election, and it was off the record. You said something along the lines to me that I've always remembered. You said Donald Trump is not the most evil man in the world. Fred Trump, his father, was.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Sure. My grandfather was a straight up sociopath. He cared about his business. He cared about money. He punished people who didn't live up to his completely ridiculous expectations very harshly. And if you didn't fit into his idea of what you needed to be in order to serve his purposes, he just wrote you off. Donald watched what happened to my dad, who was 8 years older, the oldest son, who was supposed to be the heir apparent, the namesake. And he watched my father fail to be the killer that my grandfather needed him or wanted him to be. He watched him be punished for being kind, for admitting his mistakes, for being interested in the wrong things. And after his own neglect that he experienced as a child, Donald learned very early on that in order to be safe, in order to protect himself from my grandfather's cruelty, he needed to make himself in his dad's image, which I think was at the expense of his humanity. My grandfather had no redeeming characteristics. I think we could argue the same thing about Donald now. I think he no longer does. But I think there was a point at which, he wasn't as cruel. He wasn't as deliberately divisive. And now obviously the context is completely different, and he has so many more enablers. that I don't even think we can discuss any ways in which he might be redeemable.
Yeah, your book is a very harsh account of what happened in part to your father,
Yep.
Fred Trump Jr., known as Freddie within the family. And it does, and your thesis does seem to be that your grandfather actively, sought his psychological destruction because he did not follow his father, your grandfather's, footsteps and meet his expectations. He wanted to be a pilot. He didn't want to take over the Trump real estate development business. And it seems like your father had a very hard time navigating that. He was an alcoholic. This certainly didn't help. Did you have any idea that your dad was going through all this at the time? I mean, you of course were a kid, but and you later became a clinical psychologist. But at the time, could you see what was happening between your grandfather and your father? And, I don't know, any impact it might have had at Donald at the time, or is this something you came to or realized when you were an adult?
In terms of Trump management and my dad's role in it, my father had every intention of working for his father and, making his way up the ladder and someday taking over. That was his goal. I have spoken to many friends of his from college and from growing up. There was no question about it. Unfortunately, I think by the time my dad joined the company after graduating from college, my grandfather had already rendered his verdict that Freddie was not the person he wanted him to be. He wasn't the person he trusted to take over his business. So he never gave my dad a chance. So after 3 years of misery and humiliation, he just couldn't take it anymore. And he developed a passion for flying in college. He graduated from Lehigh with his personal and professional pilot's licenses. And in 1963, the jet age was taking off, so to speak. And after an 8-year moratorium, TWA, Pan Am, et cetera, were hiring again. And he applied to TWA and was accepted on his first try into their class of 1964.
And we have to say that was a big deal.
It was a huge.
That was like being drafted by the NBA in a way, right? It's being pilots or celebrities. They had it. There was a big demand for pilots as they were expanding, but it was still a hard thing to do. And people looked up to pilots. It was an accomplishment.
Yeah, they were like demigods, and my grandfather responded to that by treating my dad like he had given it all up to, I don't know, collect garbage, or he called him a glorified bus driver. And my dad just could not get out from under it because Fred Trump was so powerful. And for whatever reason, his opinion mattered more to my father than I think anything else. And TWA actually offered my father a promotion. They wanted to train him on the 727. And by then my dad he said, no, nope. So this is heartbreaking. His career as a professional pilot for TWA lasted 4 months.
Now, this is before you were born, correct?
This was in 1964. I was born in 65. So by the time I was born, we were living back in Jamaica, Queens, and my dad was working back in Brooklyn, unhappily, very unhappily. And nothing changed in terms of the dynamic between him and his father. My grandfather put him nominally in charge of a steeplechase, which was a development taking over an old amusement park and wanting to turn it into a residential development. And there was no hope that it was going to work out, which is probably why my grandfather made my dad the face of it, because he then got all the blame for it.
Two pieces of ancient family history that just, strike me as being interesting. One is that Friedrich Trump, Donald Trump's grandfather, the father of Fred Trump, so your great-grandfather, died of Spanish flu during the 1918 epidemic. That strikes me as a significant fact. Do you make anything of that? Donald Trump must know this, right? He must know his grandfather died in the last great epidemic we had.
Yeah, although he seems to think it was in 1917, which is
Well, yeah, we'll give him that year, but nevertheless.
um, but one of the things that's really striking to me about it is that I didn't know about this until I read about it somewhere a couple of years ago. My great grandfather was never mentioned in my family. Um, so I have no way of knowing how or if he even influenced my grandfather, who was, I think, 12 or 13 when he died. The only time I've read anything in which my grandfather addressed it was his death. And he basically said, well, kids, it didn't really bother me. Like, okay, that's an odd thing to say about the children's universal response to the death of a parent. But he just didn't seem to be bothered by it much.
Now, there's a New York Times story from 1927 that reported that Fred Trump was one of a few people who were arrested at a KKK rally and march in Jamaica, Queens, where
Yeah.
fighting had broken out. The Times story doesn't say why he was arrested, if he was there as a supporter of the KKK, a bystander, whatever, but he was there. Was this ever discussed within your family? Was there ever, like this old story about your grandfather being arrested? Did you ever
No,
hear about you never heard about this?
no, you think he'd be proud of it, but because I have no doubt which side he would have been on. But
Well, be specific here.
oh, sorry. Yeah, my grandfather was quite anti-Semitic. He was perfectly comfortable using his connections in real estate. The Democratic Party in New York and a lot of real estate developers, certainly back then, were Jewish, and he had no problem making use of that and those connections. But privately, he was quite anti-Semitic and racist. So, but no, that story was never told. My family didn't tell stories. It's almost much like Donald. They sort of live perpetually in the present. And honestly, the only thing that surprises me about that story is that my grandfather took time away from his business to attend anything because he had no interests outside of his business.
Now, you told Rachel Maddow that within your family, the use of the N-word and anti-Semitic language was common, and that even Donald, and I shouldn't say even, but and that Donald Trump also used such language. Do you remember specific accounts, or are you just remembering sort of generalities? This is just how people talked when the family gathered.
Yeah, it was. It was unsurprising, and don't get me wrong, it's not like every other word out of their mouth was a racial slur, an anti-Semitic slur, but this was back when practically everybody I knew, or sorry, the parents of all my friends, or many of my friends, and other people of those generations would lower their voices to a whisper when they said the word black, as if there was something wrong with that word, or they would use Yiddish for black, just as my grandfather. It's the same word, schwarze, and not in a complimentary way, So it was, the water in which they swum. New York, Queens, which I think is now one of the most diverse places on the planet now, was not back in the 40s and 50s.
So what we see now in terms of Donald Trump's racism, and it sounds hyperbolic to say that, but going through his birth of conspiracy theory, his attitude towards the Black Lives Matter protests, his constant belittling of Black sports figures as being stupid and dumb and low IQ for Black members of Congress. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to say that he is a racist. But it seems as if that, I don't know if this is the right terminology, but it was certainly inherited or learned from or developed or came out of a family in which these attitudes were prevalent.
Yeah. No, I don't think there's anything hyperbolic about it at all. And I've never understood the media's need to dance around it. to come up with it. The same thing happened with lying. Like, how many synonyms can we use? It's racially tinged, racially charged, racial. No, he's racist. It has to be said honestly and straightforwardly. And I think, what's also at play here, or certainly was at play when he was growing up, is that whether he was consciously aware of it or not, and I doubt he was, and whether my grandfather was consciously aware of it or not, Donald wasn't very good at things. And, self-aggrandizement aside, I think it always helped prop his ego up a little bit to find people he could claim were weaker and stupider.
Well, this leads me to my next question. Thank you for the segue. You write that Fred Trump believed, quote, "In life, there can only be one winner and everybody else is a loser." Uh-huh. That does seem to be Donald Trump's attitude. And of course, he's the winner and the only winner, the only one who saw everything. He was always right about the coronavirus. He's the only one who knows this. He believes that he could negotiate nuclear arms agreements within an hour. Yeah, he said back in the 80s. Is there something more to this attitude than arrogance?
Oh, yeah. And, to me, the perfect example and one of the most tragic examples is what he did to the exonerated five, but who were at the time known as the Central Park Five. DNA has cleared them, and he's still saying they're guilty. So it's not just arrogance, because he can't even accept being contradicted by facts. I think what we need to remember is that just as kindness was a weakness in my family, so too was admitting mistakes. And I think over time, Donald has gone from refusing to admit mistakes to truly believing he's never wrong. So if you are always right and you know more than everybody, compromise doesn't make any sense, because then you would be compromising with people who are wrong and know less than you. So why bother? If you have to be right all the time and you have to be more knowledgeable and perfect, then everybody should come to where you are in an argument. And that's pretty much how he treats people and negotiations.
What explains his, at least to me, inexplicable attraction toward corrupt autocrats like Vladimir Putin?
It stems from my grandfather. These are people who know how to manipulate him. They understand that basically his psychology is very simple in some ways. And as I write, my grandfather essentially turned Donald into somebody who could be made use of by more powerful men. And I think he sees in somebody like a Putin or a Kim Jong-un or Duterte or an Erdogan, a person who has a lot of power, and by associated with them, it sort of confers on him that aura of strength and invincibility. And who cares, what that leads to, concentration camps in China or disappearing people. If he's associated with that, then it reflects on him. And that doesn't happen with, a Macron or a Merkel. Well, she's a woman, so he wouldn't associate with her anyway. But you know what I'm saying? In Western democracies, they're not strong men, and that doesn't appeal to him.
Now, you touched on this a moment ago. Trump is always promoting alternative and false narratives. Like when he said the other day that he's been right all along about the coronavirus, more right than anybody else. Of course, that's not true. The Washington Post has compiled a database of over 19,000 false statements and lies he has told since becoming president. And they even say that some of these are lies. They've gotten to that point. and this is one question that has puzzled me now for years, Mary, for years. And I don't have an answer. Maybe you can help. Does he believe his lies? Is he delusional, or does he know he's conning people?
So what I would say is it depends on the circumstance. I talk about the time when I met Melania for the first time. And I'd gotten there early, so it's just the three of us. It was a little awkward. So Donald starts telling Melania about the time that he had hired me to write one of his books. He said, at the time, Mary had been a mess. She was a drug addict. Then I'm like, wait a minute. I was never a drug addict. I've never done drugs in my life. And he knew that he was making it up, but it made a better story. It kind of fits in with his comeback narrative. The worse you are when you start your comeback, the greater the comeback scenes. And he had gone through the same thing in the 90s. He had been in the gutter and in his mind had just accomplished so much and was at the height of his powers. On the other hand, though, I think the more stress he's under, the more besieged he feels, the more likely it is that the distance between his telling the lie and his believing that it's the truth is decreasing until I think we're getting to the point where it's almost instantaneous.
So when he says the polls are great for me, I still don't know if he's just saying that because he's a salesman and, you never admit that your polls are bad, or if, he thinks, they showed him something and he believes everything else that's being reported is false. And this one poll that maybe looks better for him is fantastic. And he's going to push that. I wrote a book about George W. Bush and his lies when he was president. I thought long and hard about public officials who lie. And with your uncle, I don't know. I don't know if he spins tales, knows they're false at the time, and then comes to believe them, or if he kind of knows that it's just bullshit and I'll say whatever I need to say to get what I need at that particular moment in time, and truth and reality just don't matter.
Is it just delusion, or is it a tactic? And I think it might start out as a tactic, but it ends up being delusion, because his need to perpetuate a narrative about himself, a very specific narrative about himself as the winner, as always being right, is decades old. It's a defense mechanism to protect him against the reality of who he really is, which I think if he had any insight into that, I don't know that he could bear
it. In the book, you write about several times Trump talked about women in degrading and misogynistic ways, often calling them ugly, fat slobs, which we've seen him do in public. Yep. Where do you think this comes from? And did you feel, in your interactions with him, that he saw you in a diminished way because you were a woman?
Well, my whole family is a bunch of misogynists. Like even the women in my family were pretty misogynistic. So it's not that there was anything specific, but it was very clear, at least on an unconscious level. Well, okay, then it wasn't clear because it was unconscious, but it became clear eventually that on an unconscious level growing up, I was absolutely a second-class citizen. My education didn't matter, what I wanted to be. My grandfather thought I should be a receptionist, didn't matter what my ambitions were. I probably shouldn't have even had them. He was, even when I was at Columbia in grad school, my grandfather thought I was wasting my time and being selfish, so women were treated very differently, and dismissed. With the exception of that one time he commented, quite inappropriately on my appearance, considering I was his niece. It would have been inappropriate anyway, but especially as I was his niece. I was down in Mar-a-Lago for the very first time, and it was casual. We were eating outside. I'd been in the pool. I put on some shorts and I was wearing my bathing suit, and he looked up at me, and it was literally like he didn't know who I was. And he just said, I can't swear, right? He said, holy expletive, Mary, you're stacked. And it also made me realize it's the first time anybody in my family outside of my parents and brother had ever seen me in a bathing suit. And I was like 29. So, we weren't that kind of family. But yeah, it was, I was not a kid, but it still embarrassed me.
Well, in the book, you note that you hid your wedding to a woman from the Trump family and that your aunt didn't even know that you had a daughter with your wife. Was this because homophobia in the Trump family was so deeply rooted?
There was no discussion of it when I was a kid because it wasn't a thing among a certain class of people. It was just not spoken of. So I made that assumption. I think it was a pretty easy leap from the racism and misogyny to the homophobia.
In the book, you write that for Donald Trump, nothing is ever enough. And all that matters really is his own suffering and whether you or somebody else can alleviate it or not. You say the simple fact is that Donald is fundamentally incapable of acknowledging the suffering of others. My question is, did you write these words before the pandemic?
Yes.
That seems pretty prescient.
I wish it hadn't been, because I didn't see this coming, and it's quite devastating that he's had this kind of opportunity to demonstrate his not just his incompetence, but his egregious lack of caring about fellow human beings.
A few people who've read your book already have raised a similar point to me. By explaining Trump's horror show presidency as the result of his neglect by his father, are you in a way giving him an escape route? I mean, after all, a lot of people have terrible parents and they don't end up putting kids in cages and not giving a damn about tens of thousands of people dying.
I can't say this emphatically enough. Absolutely not. This was not in any way intended to let him off the hook. He's maybe not. He's responsible for his actions. He's an adult human being who knows the difference between right and wrong. He just doesn't think it applies to him, but he knows the difference. The point of the analysis of his developmental history was in its explanatory power. Practically everybody I know had some kind of issues in their childhood. Some people I know had horrific childhoods, and they're decent, upstanding human beings who care about other people, who care about what happens in this country, who care about what happens in the world. Donald is not one of them. He does not get a pass. He needs to be held to account. Very seriously held to account when this nightmare we're living through is over. I wish you were being held to account now, but clearly that's not going to happen.
In the book, you write that Trump's struggle for legitimacy, which could never be won, turned into a scheme to make sure nobody found out that he's never been legitimate at all. Mm-hmm. So does he really know that he's a fraud in some ways?
I don't think he does. And so when I say, he's embarked on this project, I think it's a largely unconscious project. It's just another way of enacting his defense mechanisms. And, we have to remember the people closest to him are whispering all this stuff in his ear. You're great. You're the best. You're always right. This is what you should do. So how could he know, even if he were capable of knowing?
I mean, it takes a lot to say you are the smartest man in the room all the time and know more than the generals, know more than the epidemiologists. It's hard to believe a grown man, anybody, truly believing that. And maybe that's what makes him a sociopath. I don't know. I am not a psychologist.
As far as the idea that he always believes he's the smartest person in the room and he knows more than the generals, he's always gotten away with it. And one of the things I found most astonishing about the election was when he said something like that, nobody ever pushed back. Okay, wait a second. How do you know more? What books have you read? What's your experience? how many years have you spent in X, Y, or Z country to know that you understand? Do you have a degree in nuclear physics? Do you have you know what I'm saying? It's like the list is endless. There was so many ways to push back, and it was like, okay, let's move on to the next question so we can get another stupid answer that we're not going to push back on. So it blew my mind.
Now, in your acknowledgments in the book, you thanked me for being kind. I have to ask, what did I do to deserve such a mention?
I mean, I don't know if you picked up on this or not, but certainly after the election, I was a mess. I was having a very, very, very difficult time. And I know you were after a story. I know you were eager to have me be a source. You seemed genuinely concerned, and I don't know. It's hard to explain, but I just felt that you were a genuine person. I'd also admired your work for a really long time, but mostly it was just your demeanor on the phone. Even though I knew I was disappointing you, I always felt better after we spoke, and I appreciated it because it was a very dark time, and I was pretty isolated. I live in a Republican town. I was very isolated for a few months after that. So just meant a lot to me.
I'm glad it helped in that regard. I mean, you were clearly in pain, and I could clearly feel your pain. And it also seemed, as a reporter, that you wanted to talk about it in a way that that at least talking to me on the phone, but that you were looking for ways to share with what you knew with the public at large.
Right.
Took a little while, but it seems that you found a way to do that. Now it's possible that your uncle could be reelected. Can you imagine that? And what will you do if that happens?
I can't imagine it. I try really hard not to think about it. So I can't answer that question. My mind just cannot go there right now. Yeah, it would just be devastating, not just personally. It would be devastating for this country and many of the people living in it. So I need to focus on anything positive that can happen between now and November 3rd. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And if actually, I think if that did happen, I probably will not be able to speak articulately. I was going to say, yeah, we could revisit it then, but I don't think I would be able to. I laugh, even though it's really not funny.
Well, Mary, thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for writing the book. I know it's been a tough time for you over the past couple of years. I hope this all works out. I know it's a big seller, so people are rewarding you in that regard. But whatever else you're looking for, I hope you get that.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. This has been great.